From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
All right. Well, good afternoon. Thanks for coming. My name is Jason Steinhauer. I'm a program specialist at the John W. Kluge Center at the Library of Congress. Before we begin today's program, please take a moment to check your cell phones and other electronic devices, and please set them to silent. I'll also make you aware that this afternoon's program is being filmed for placement on the Kluge Center's website, as well as our YouTube and iTunes U playlists. I encourage you to visit our website, loc.gov/Kluge, to view other lectures delivered by current and past Kluge scholars, including several on military history, veterans history, and lectures by past Kluge Fellows. Today's lecture is presented by the John W. Kluge Center at the Library of Congress. The Kluge Center is a vibrant scholars center on Capitol Hill that brings together scholars and researchers from around the world to stimulate and energize one another, to distill wisdom from the library's rich resources, and to interact with policymakers and the public. The center offers opportunities for senior scholars, postdoctoral fellows, and PhD candidates to conduct research in the Library of Congress collections. We also offer free public lectures, conferences, symposia, and other programs, and we administer the Kluge Prize, which recognizes lifetime achievement in the fields of humanity and social sciences, and which we will award in 2015. For more information about these and other events, please sign our list or visit our website, loc.gov/Kluge. Today's lecture is titled Before Trauma, Nostalgia, or the Melancholy of War. Our speaker is Thomas Dodman, now concluding his tenure as a Kluge Fellow at the Library of Congress. Thomas's research focuses on the psychological impact of war. His research draws on several manuscript collections held by the Library of Congress. Thomas is tracing the origins of the word nostalgia, and in particular, nostalgia as a battlefield illness, the terminology during the 18th and early 19th centuries designating a war-induced trauma and perhaps a precursor to what is today known as post-traumatic stress disorder. Dodman has used government records, soldiers' letters, novels, artwork, and more to provide insight into the medical, military, and colonial history of this emotion and the inner emotional lives of our predecessors living at the dawn of the modern age. Thomas Dodman is Assistant Professor of History at Boston College and an affiliate scholar at the Center for European Studies at Harvard University. He received his PhD in History with distinction from the University of Chicago and his MA and BA from University College London. Prior to his position at Boston College, he was an assistant professor at George Mason University, as well as a teacher and lecturer at Sciences Po Paris and University of Chicago. His first book is tentatively titled The Making of Nostalgia, War, Empire, and Medicine in France, 1680 to 1880, and is forthcoming from University of Chicago Press. It is the subject of his research here at the Kluge Center. So please join me in welcoming Thomas Dodman.
Thank you, Jason. I couldn't have said it better myself. Now I know what my book is actually about. Thank you very much for organizing this. Thank you to the Kluge Center and to all of its members for making my stay here so enjoyable. Thank you all for showing up here today for this lecture. All wars, big and small, are catastrophes of one sort or another for those whom they affect. To this day, Francisco Goya's depiction of the disasters of war, is that going to work? Of which you have many very, very nice collections here at the Library of Congress, remains one of the most searing indictments of the horrors unleashed by military conflicts, in this case, the guerrilla warfare and counterinsurgency operations waged by Spaniards and Frenchmen during Napoleon's occupation of Spain in the early 1800s. This series of 80 etchings captures with gruesome frankness the violence unleashed by a conflict in which, perhaps for the first time, the people became a participant in war, as Karl von Clausewitz famously put it, inaugurating an era of mass mobilization, behind war efforts, and mass retribution against civilian populations. This was total war, Goya seems to be telling us, a war of destruction and annihilation. But what of its perpetrators? What of this Napoleonic soldier down here, whose deeds speak for themselves and for the incipient brutalization of warfare, and whose relaxed, melancholy pose seems to evoke what Hannah Arendt would later dub the banality of evil? Or does it maybe suggest something else about how he actually felt? I want to put that as a question for the time being. I don't think it actually does, but it actually serves my purposes if it did. So, what I would like to do today is explore a little-known aspect of these wars, namely the inner life, what I call the inner life, and the emotional history of the soldiers who fought during the Napoleonic era and early 19th century, particularly French citizen soldiers. I approach this question through the lens of pathology, or the psychological and emotional breakdown of these men, thus in a sense asking of them questions more commonly formulated in the context of 20th century conflicts. That is, after the establishment of military psychiatry as a profession and a core within the army, within most armies. It is a difficult task, both because of the dangers of conceptual anachronism, and I'll come back to what I mean by that in a second, and also because of the dearth of sources, of the kind of qualitative ego documents that characterize a period before the advent of mass literacy and mass schooling. I approached this drawing from research into two related projects that I've been pursuing over this past year as a Kluge Fellow. One, the broad medical history of nostalgia in the 18th and 19th century that Jason referred to, and which I am mercifully seeing through to conclusion this summer, or at least my editor is convinced that I am. And a second project, a biography of a French revolutionary volunteer based on his extraordinary correspondence with his family. And this is material that I discovered last summer in France, in Provence, in a lovely little hilltop village, in a private archive, after having searched for these letters for about 3 years. And it's kind of derailed a lot of what I was planning to do here. But it's also a very exciting project that I sort of feel compelled to bring forth now. So what I'm trying to do here is bridge a little bit these two projects in this lecture. I'll start with this scene of misery after the Battle of Waterloo, which of course we've just celebrated the 200th, so the bicentennial of. I'm partly British and partly French, so there's only half of me that's actually celebrated it. Yet the other half has sort of tried to forget the whole thing. But so the Battle of Waterloo, which of course brought a definitive end to the Napoleonic Wars in 1815. In A Soldier at Waterloo, the military painter Horace Vernet depicted a distraught French grenadier sitting on a sepulchral mound and a half-buried fallen comrade. At his feet lie scattered debris of battle and of a now-defunct Napoleonic empire itself, symbolized down here by the Napoleonic eagle. It looks rather like the American eagle, but... so in the background, there are, of course, more corpses. They litter a broken landscape against the vibrant, romantic colors of sunset, which signal both the end of the day, but also the end of an epoch, too. We, or at least I, don't actually know that much about this painting. The theme clearly possessed the young Vernet at a time when it was quite dangerous to show one's Napoleonic feelings. This is the post-Napoleonic Bonapartist restoration, and definitely not. This wasn't a good thing for him to do. He wasn't allowed to display the painting in the salon as he had done previously, and had to put it on show in his artist's studio only in 1822 as part of a diptych. Together with The Soldier as Plowman as its pendant, which you have here on the right. Vernet treaded carefully, suggesting that a Napoleonic veteran had traded sword for spade and quietly returned to farm the land. This is, in fact, one of the very first representations of that apocryphal figure of the soldier Chauvin, which is turned into a sort of legend in early 19th century French songs and literature, and to which we owe the word chauvinism. To whom we owe the word chauvinism. A Soldier at Waterloo circulated widely thereafter thanks to its reproduction as a cheap print, which you can see here on the left, which wisely removed the Napoleonic eagle. Suddenly it's not there anymore. There are only two cannons. Within the more tolerant context of the July monarchy, so from 1830 to 1848, this same picture even came to adorn the second edition of that Bible of Bonapartism, Las Casas' Memorial of St. Helena, which you have here over on the right. As you can see, this is the front. This is the first actual page of text with the same image on the top here. Which is, of course, this is the result of the conversations between Las Casas and Napoleon during his exile in St. Helena. This is the second edition of the book, published in 1842, the first edition that was allowed in France, at a time when Napoleon's ashes had just returned to Paris. So it's part of the sort of glorification of Napoleonic legend. Vernet's A Soldier at Waterloo thus came to be a potent symbol of the kind of Napoleonic nostalgia that pervades much of 19th century French political culture, nowhere more strongly, of course, than among the legion of disgruntled veterans who survived and sort of maintained this nostalgia for their beloved emperor. And you only have to read the novels of Balzac to really sort of get a sense of this. This is a nostalgia that we are familiar with today. The wistful, thoroughly romanticized and utterly benign longing for the past that has been lost, or perhaps never quite was, at least not in the embellished version that we remember. But this is not what nostalgia actually meant in the early 1800s, and no misty-eyed Bonapartist would have actually described himself as nostalgique at the time. In fact, no romantic poet, nobody would have described themselves as nostalgic, because it meant something quite different. A contemporary dictionary defined the term thus: an illness caused by a violent desire to return to one's homeland. In other words, a technical synonym for what we might call in vernacular language homesickness, a term that already existed in French as mal du pays and in German as Heimweh. What I would like to suggest is that Vernet's picture speaks to this earlier medical understanding of nostalgia and actually fits into an obscure iconographic tradition of what was once defined as a specific form of melancholia or depression, affecting soldiers in particular, a melancholy of war, as it were. The soldier's pose strongly suggests that Vernet's painting was inspired by the rich tradition of representations of melancholia reaching back to the Renaissance, and perhaps best identified with Albrecht Dürer's famous Melancholia I, which you have here on the right. I mean, I think there are a number of similarities, not just the pose, obviously, but also the sort of objects littered on the ground, the presence of a skull and corpses, and the backdrop. I think there's enough here to suggest that this may well have been an influence, at least indirectly. Vernet was not the only military artist who turned to depicting the disasters of war and inner lives of soldiers at the time. Albrecht Adams' study of a wounded cuirassier from 1812 is remarkably similar in this respect. You have him down here on the left. I'm sorry, the picture's really not all that good, but hopefully you can just about see it well enough. In fact, the dog lying at his feet may be seen not only as a symbol of melancholy, which it is, of course, but also as a nod to a concept of home, and to Argos, Odysseus' dog, who is the first to recognize his master upon his return to Ithaca, suggesting perhaps that this soldier's melancholy thoughts are actually homesick ones. There is, in fact, a more niche kind of iconographic tradition that explicitly depicts homesick soldiers in this very melancholy pose. It starts with 17th century and 18th century tales of a Swiss herdsman's song, the Kuereien, or Rance des Vaches, which allegedly made burly Swiss mercenaries stationed abroad collapse should they hear the melody, the familiar melody. And according to the legend, they weren't even allowed to sort of play this melody, otherwise they would all just drop dead from nostalgia. As soon as they heard cowbells too, they would just sort of fall over. And so these are the first sort of attested cases of death by nostalgia. The tradition reaches all the way to World War I. World War I postcards depicting homesick men such as this one, which you have here on the right, again adopting the melancholy pose. And it passes by very similar images of homesickness, such as these ones here, of which there are some wonderful examples here at the Library of Congress. These are images of homesick soldiers during the American Civil War, both this one and the next, which are quite the same, but I think sort of really convey the same sort of message ultimately. What all of these soldiers suffered from and at least up until the American Civil War died off. The American Civil War is really the last conflict in which nostalgia is used in this medical sense that I'm beginning to sketch right now, was this form of melancholia known as nostalgia. This is what they suffered from. This is what they died from. On the 18th of November 1793, following a year of intense fighting along the, with Austrian and Prussian forces along the Belgian border, the general in command of the French Army of the Nord was informed by the War Ministry of measures necessary to preserve the ranks as the troops dug into their positions for the winter. The ministry was appalled by incoming reports describing hordes of deserters found wandering on the highways, and it ordered the general to suspend indefinitely all existing furloughs and special permissions. New leaves were to be granted parsimoniously, it added, and only specifically in one medical case, to sick men suffering from nostalgia or mal du pays. This is the time when the Prussians are closing in on Paris, and we have to abolish all leaves except for men suffering by nostalgia. As astonishing as this may sound, this was not a quirky fantasy of some proto-romantic bureaucrat. 12 months later, following a year of terror and mass mobilization on an unprecedented scale, the French revolutionary government took steps to extend the provision to hundreds of thousands of French troops, making this nostalgia an almost talismanic diagnosis with which military doctors could release the men from active duty and send them home on a temporary furlough, typically 3 months. A 3-month medical leave. Sometimes they would be reassigned to a unit operating closer to home. But this is really quite a systematic operation that was put in place. These extraordinary measures remained in place throughout the Napoleonic Wars and right up until the mid-19th century. And they're reaffirmed in government directives year after year, prompting physicians to estimate that the condition was as widespread as typhus and scurvy in the ranks, and that it might well have killed up to 1 in 20 men in some regiments. As the revered Dictionnaire des Sciences Médicales noted in 1818, no epoch has witnessed as many cases of nostalgia as the French Revolution and the wars it precipitated. Although we may be tempted to reach for our copy of Homer's Odysseus, we did not, for the term nostalgia was then relatively new, having only been around since the late 1600s, when a 19-year-old medical... Oh, sorry, I forgot to show this. This is the kind of medical certificate that a soldier desperately would have sought during the Revolutionary Wars. This is you can't quite read it down here, but here it explains that this soldier is affected by nostalgia and therefore needs to be sent back home for 3 months. Okay, so this is the kind of evidence that shows that this was actually a real concern. In the late 60s, 1688 to be precise, a medical student at the faculty of Basel coined this neologism from the Greek roots nostos, home, and algos, pain or longing. Johannes Hofer, whose dissertation you can see here, thus sought to describe and give legitimacy to reports of Heimweh among his contemporaries, especially these Swiss mercenaries fighting in Louis XIV's army. Drawing eclectically from post-humoral physiology and psychology, he described this new clinical entity in terms of a passion of the soul and the corruption of the animal spirit. This is very much the language of the time. This was caused by an obsessive longing for home, or as he put it, the sadness, the tristem animum, generated by the burning desire to see one's homeland again. So again, you get this sense this is very much a spatial homesickness that he's talking about. There's none of the sort of temporal, diachronic sense that we have with the word nostalgia. If left untreated, nostalgia would breed melancholy and consumptive wasting away of organic faculties, leading the patient to death by exhaustion or some other concomitant disease. Although he never quite made it into the annals of medical history, nostalgia did successfully establish itself in 18th century medical circles, attracting the attention of prominent Enlightenment physicians and philosophes such as Rousseau and Kant, who wrote actually quite extensively about nostalgia. As the tautological saying has it, nostalgia truly ain't what it used to be. Just what it actually was is may be gleaned from the only visual representation of a deadly case of nostalgia that I'm aware of and that I found in the Prince Division of the French National Library. This is an 1832 engraving titled Le Mal du Pays, so homesickness, by the military artist Hippolyte Bélanger, who was also very close to Vernet, a slightly later generation, but all these people were very much in the same sort of artistic milieu. By adopting the standard motifs from the iconography of illness and of 18th century moral paintings, that is, the interior domestic scene centered around a deathbed, the somber atmosphere lighted only by the liturgical presence of a nurse, Bélanger clearly sought to convey the idea that mal du pays was, indeed, a serious and potentially fatal illness. The patient's sorrowful expression, and again the presence of the dog at his side, served to underscore nostalgia's well-established connection to as sort of well-established understanding as an emotional disorder and nosological connection to melancholia. At the same time, his emaciated facial traits and prominent skeletal chest also suggest the physiognomy of an enfeebled poitrinaire, so a chested person, wasting away to a suspect case of consumption or phthisis, pulmonary tuberculosis, which in the days of pre-bacteriological medicine, so throughout most of the 19th century, was thought to be caused by sad passions such as nostalgia. And there's a whole literature of how nostalgia can, including by the inventor of the stethoscope, Laennec. He's convinced that nostalgia is really what causes tuberculosis, including amongst himself. He eventually dies of tuberculosis himself. Beyond this immediate clinical picture, the condition is also clearly identified in epidemiological terms as a soldier's disease caused by displacement. The traveling trunks that you can see here above the soldier's bed, and his cap, which is an early model of the lightweight casquette d'Afrique that the French troops adopted when they sort of moved into Algeria in 1830 and replaced the iconic but impractical shackles of the Napoleonic armies, helped situate this scene precisely in Algeria during the 1830s. That this was a form of homesickness is also likewise evidence in the central chronotopic marker of the composition, the letter that this troupier africain holds on to, having apparently just read it, and that seems to point towards a home symbolized here yet again by the metonymical figure of the faithful spaniel. And specifically, this is an Épagnol breton, a Brittany spaniel, which raises the suspicion that this soldier is actually from Brittany, is a Breton, and the Breton happen to be sort of the stuff of legend, just like the Swiss are following epidemics of nostalgia that allegedly decimated entire companies of Breton conscripts during the Revolutionary Army. So I think this Bélanger is sort of signifying that by choosing this specific kind of dog. Bélanger chose to immortalize the homesick trooper precisely in that keenly awaited but often bittersweet moment when mail from France arrived, momentarily bridging that gap separating him from home. While reinforcing the spatial understanding of nostalgia on the one hand, as a symptom of a widespread anxiety as to the accrued mobility of populations in an era of economic development, war, and colonial expansion, the letter also suggests, I think, that what is really at stake here is a more abstract, emotional form of estrangement that Bélanger sought to convey with the anonymous, faceless silhouettes in the background, the reifying reduction of the patient to a number above his head, he's just patient 134, and the compassionate presence of a sympathetic nurse, an incongruous female and maternal figure who alone seems to be able to actually touch and empathize with this soldier in what is otherwise a very virile, anonymous, anomic universe of the army. As the polyphonous notion of the pays in French also reveals, what what the homesick person longed for was not just a specific locale, a cartographic locale. A pays is also a living community of people rooted in a particular place and embedded in customs, qualitative social networks, and most of all, memories. So in a sense, pays is very much like Heimat in German. It's a sort of very loaded concept. The medical discourse of nostalgia, as encapsulated here in Bélanger's poignant image, tells us something important about how we can reconstruct the emotional lives and experiences of soldiers from the past. It reveals a little-known story of psychological breakdown at once unique to this epoch and yet uncannily similar to that of warriors across the ages, including today. But what of trauma in all this? Does trauma even fit into this picture? Well, yes and no, as historians often like to say. The symptoms described in the medical reports, and which were typically subsumed under the umbrella diagnosis nostalgia, are telling in regard. Headaches, insomnia, nightmares, panic attacks, deliriums, and despair, as well as conversion disorders described already then as hysterical, which with unexplained, that is functional, neurological manifestations such as temporary deafness, blindness and aphonia, respiratory difficulties, partial paralyses, and epileptic fits. After 1815, many veterans with frayed nerves wound up in the first modern psychiatric asylums in France, where they were diagnosed with various forms of aliénation mentale, what we would call a psychosis today. Their memoirs speak poignantly of recurrent nightmares and flashbacks, of endless visions of streams of blood, severed limbs, and expressions of horror on mangled faces of the dead people they were surrounded by, just like Horace Vernet's Grenadier at Waterloo. In other words, they speak of intrusive, traumatic memories. In fact, there is little to distinguish from a symptomatological point of view the Napoleonic soldier diagnosed with nostalgia from the shell-shocked Tommy evacuated from the Western Front during the First World War, or the veterans of Vietnam and Iraq diagnosed with PTSD today. The most effective kinds of treatments were remarkably similar as well. Before sending homesick men home on leave, Napoleonic medical officers experimented with a rudimentary abreactive cure reminiscent of Freudian catharsis and countless other talking cures that have been sort of devised since, all of which, pretty much, are geared towards allaying painful feelings by bringing repressed psychic material out, as it were. I'd even venture so far as to say that Vernet's Soldier at Waterloo prefigures the kind of physical and psychological scarring of landscapes, bodies, and minds that so marks the artwork, poetry, and literature of those who lived through the hell of mechanized warfare in 1914 and up to 1918. And so here I think there are analogies with the corpses, dead bodies on a battlefield were not represented in military artwork up until this point. So this is really the first time you actually sort of see these kind of putrefaction of bodies, which you, of course, then will find much more present in World War I iconography. I think the lunar landscape that Nash painted here with the sort of dawn at the back or the dawn of a new age or the setting of an old age is also something that I think relates to what Vernet is doing. And of course, Otto Dix's famous auto-portraits, which describe in graphic detail his own decomposition as a soldier experiencing the horrors of war, starts off with a similar sort of melancholy pose that I think is also establishes a nice connection with Vernet. So I think for all these reasons, this seems to be something to suggest that we might want to speak of this as a form of trauma. So yes, but also no. No Napoleonic physician actually spoke of all of this in terms of trauma, nor could they, for that matter. Simply put, there was no concept of psychogenic trauma available at the time. The word traumatisme existed, but it was only used exclusively for physical trauma, so the impact of bullets or wounds. There wouldn't be this psychogenic concept of trauma, historians now agree, until the last third of the 19th century, when theories of railway spine or nervous shock caused by railway accidents paved the way for Jean-Martin Charcot's psychoneurological accounts of hysteria, and in turn the psychodynamic ones of people like Genet, Freud, and Brouwer. Take, for instance, the legions of hopeless Breton conscripts, or these famous Breton conscripts, whom the medical officer Denis Gerbois, whose dissertation on nostalgia you see here. This is one example. This is the first example of about 75 medical dissertations on nostalgia that I've found so far. That French medical officers, mostly demobilized army medical officers, defended throughout the 19th century as a way of obtaining their MD, so as to practice in civilian life as well. So these legions of Breton conscripts whom the medical officer Denis Gerbois struggled to rescue from fatal nostalgia in the army during the 1790s, he compared their sense of loss when joining the army to the sudden weaning of an infant from its wet nurse's breast or its mother's breast. And when I first saw that, I said, wow, Freud existed before. He did. Yet, upon second reading, you realize that in no instance does Gerbois actually conceive of this likeness in terms of childhood sexuality or of the repetition of latent trauma, as we post-Freudians inevitably would. Rather, he chalked this up to a parallel experience of déchirement, which in French means both tearing apart, physical tearing apart, but also heartbreak, so a sort of inner wrenching. In other words, the physical dislocation and melancholy mood, homesickness, that simultaneously affected the well-being of body and soul, according to medical theories of the time. And Gerbois' reference to wet nurses here needs to be contextualized much more with reference to the common practice of outsourcing children, so to say, to rural wet nurses in 18th and early 19th century France, despite the vehement critiques against it waged by numerous Enlightenment figures, including Rousseau, of course. Like so many of his contemporaries, Gerbois was steeped in a loosely psychosomatic medical philosophy, fed by strands of sensationalist psychology, nerve physiology, and medical vitalism that afforded, and this is the crucial part, a critical role to feelings and emotions in the genesis of disease, including organic diseases, arguably much more so than the first theories of psychogenic trauma would a century later, because of their initial association to a very physicalist sense of shock. There's reason why the physicians spoke of shell shock. It's because they actually thought it was due to the explosion of a shell, and so there's a very sort of physicalist understanding of what this was. So what I'm actually arguing is that in a sense it was easier to diagnose war neuroses in the 18th century than it has been in the 20th century for these physicians. Let me give you another example to try to highlight the potential pitfalls of conceptual anachronism here. And so this is what I was alluding to before. Like Gerbois, Jérôme Lasserre was another young medical officer who treated numerous cases of nostalgia in the French army before being diagnosed with the ill himself and sent home to convalesce in 1795. His health never actually improved enough to sufficiently for him to be returned to active duty, and so he received a permanent discharge and set up a relatively successful practice in his hometown in southwestern France. Yet one can still find him 3 decades later, so long after the war has actually ended, trying to write a curious manual for family fathers, which you see here, in which he showcased a sophisticated artificial mammal designed for infant bottle feeding, which you've got a nice example of here. This was a booming market at the time because of the continued practice of rural wet nursing. Lasserre hoped to sell his product thanks to its what he argued was its faithful reproduction through mechanical means of the natural sensation of breastfeeding. And he claimed he could achieve that by devising an artificial nipple made of natural sponge and fine muslin cloth, as opposed to the sort of animal udder skin that was used up until then, and especially through a very, very complex system of tubes and special air inlets that would actually reproduce this sort of sense of suction, right, with the pressure involved. This was vital, he insisted, in a startling passage worth quoting at length. And I say these are not my words, because, as he put it, the pleasure that nature procures to the wet nurse during breastfeeding, and which is aroused, s'excite, as the child approaches her breast, or when she feels the effects of suction, provokes the erection of the nipple and the mammary gland's secretion. The milk then ejaculates abundantly into the child's mouth. The child in turn experiences an orgasm of the salivary glands through a movement of suction and sensation of the nipple. Saliva may then flow in quantities commensurate with its important role in the digestive system. Passages such as these, moreover when coming from a middle-aged man, make us post-Freudians squirm. At least they make my students squirm when I show it to them in class. Yet we must resist the urge to read into words and thoughts from an age and sensibility very different to our own. What Lasserre is actually saying here has nothing, absolutely nothing to do with sexuality as we understand it and the practices and norms we take it to entail. Lasserre lived at the very end of a world that preceded the invention of sexuality, as Michel Foucault defines it, that is, as an object of scientific knowledge and an occult causal agent in human behavior, a development that Foucault pinpointed quite precisely to the 1830s, that is, just after the time of Lasserre. To understand what he really meant, we must grasp things like the persistent neo-Rousseauianism of child-rearing manuals, which I've already referenced with Gerbois, the importance of digestion, of physical sensations, of emotions, and of nervous excitement in contemporary medical beliefs. There's a whole sort of unpacking of this language here that would need to be done before one can actually try to sort of interpret it. Only then might we begin to speculate on the extent to which, unknown to Lasserre himself, this research of his into a mechanical breast, which for him, he saw applications for this in orphanages, but also in non-specified institutions without mothers. The army? This kind of research for him, we could speculate, was a sort of reenacting and a working through of the trauma he experienced as homesickness on the battlefields of revolutionary France. We can sort of say that, but we can't actually say that this is what he himself thinks he's doing. As Freud says in The Uncanny, a wartime concept incidentally developed during the First World War, there is a joking saying that love is homesickness. Little did Freud know that the saying also has a prehistory, though hardly an amusing one. Reconstructing the emotional lives of these men, therefore, entails treading very carefully and trying, insofar as possible, to recompose the conceptual and social worlds in which they lived and in which their nostalgia made sense as a form, as the quintessential, first clinically defined form of soldiers' neuroses. In the few minutes I have left, let me turn to some preliminary conclusions that I've drawn from performing such an exercise with reference to this correspondence of a French Revolutionary Army volunteer that I've been working on of late. I'm only using here the letters from his first year in the army. There are about 5 years worth of these letters, several hundreds of these, which is what makes him quite extraordinary. Gabriel Noel, whom you can see here, sorry, there's a very, very poor reproduction. This is one of his letters that I'm working on, was 21 years old when he volunteered to join the 2nd Infantry Battalion of the Meurthe in northeastern France in 1791. He would serve in the army for the next 6 years, climbing the ranks to become aide-de-camp and a cavalry lieutenant, before resigning and retiring to his native village of Sommervillers, near Nancy, in 1797. Noel was, in many respects, an utterly unique soldier of the French Revolution. Born to poor peasants, he was adopted by his godmother, a local noblewoman steeped in Enlightenment writings, and raised with a stepsister, also adopted, in the spirit of the philosophe. Far more educated than the average Frenchman at the time, he wrote long, introspective, even mawkish letters to his godmother and sister almost daily, seamlessly passing from descriptions of battles and bivouacs to his enduring love for his sister and mother, or his appreciation of Condillac's writings. It's quite schizophrenic, really. Yet Noel's emotional experience of war was far from exceptional, and in fact echoed many of the concerns common to the rank and file, who couldn't write of it in such sort of eloquent fashion. The difficult adaptation to regimental life, the hardships and constant need while on campaign, the importance of finding good camarades from the pays with which to share a bed, cook a meal, and look over each other's shoulder in combat. His letters provide access to the psychological makeup of Napoleon's men, bringing into sharper focus the constant mood swings felt by countless others, from the boredom of garrison life to the paroxysms of combat, passing by that unrelenting feeling of isolation and longing to return home, or at least receive news of home in a letter. In fact, even when Noel does depart significantly from his fellow soldiers, for example, in his strong politicization, which is quite unique really at the time, he embodies the revolutionary's ideal type warrior, the bourgeois citizen who rushes to arms at the behest of the fatherland. Still, Noel found it supremely hard to live up to that ideal of the civically minded Spartan warrior sketched by Enlightenment military reformers and now summoned into existence by the revolution's politicians. As he realized upon leaving his family nest, an expression he uses systematically throughout his correspondence, in December 1791, one did not become a citizen soldier overnight. For Noel, as for many other recruits, the hyphen between these two terms actually hid a chasm separating two radically incommensurate worlds, the civilian and the military, and in between which he soon found himself stranded. Noel's acculturation to military life in 1792 was extremely testing to the young man. He was garrisoned not far from home, barely 60 miles away, and never actually strayed that far from his native region throughout his first year in the army. Despite being surrounded by fellow compatriots from Lorraine and entrusted with the mess group's meal responsibilities, Noel complained of having, quote, no real friends in the army. Letters from home were his lifeline. He felt forgotten when no mail came through, and reborn when it did, even hauled back from across the river of oblivion, sort of overblown formula. He kept his mother's and sister's letters on him at all time, literally in his shirt, and he viewed his own letters as an extension of his own persona, repeatedly expressing a wish to travel with them. When he posts his letters, he says, "I wish I could travel with these letters, even beat them home." In a fit of despair at one point, when he worries about being taken prisoner by enemy forces, he actually burns all his letters for fear that they might sort of fall in the wrong hands. It's sort of in a fit that he immediately regrets thereafter. He did not have to fight much during his first stint at the front. He witnessed the famous Battle of Valmy at a distance, and only received his baptism of fire right at the end of his first year in service. Nonetheless, he found the discipline and phony war of garrison life no less alienating. His impressions about military drill could have come straight from Foucault's pen yet again, or more likely from Candide's description of the Bulgar and Prussian discipline in Voltaire's eponymous work. I try to do the exercise as a machine and make sense of each movement. They are all intended to make us occupy as least possible a space in the ranks without disturbing the other men. These exercises are without doubt a good way of disciplining the body, of dresser le corps, and of becoming more agile, but I don't believe they help to develop the intellectual faculties of those who practice them all their life. Witness our second lieutenant. He's a good lad, has always been a soldier, and certainly knows how to perform the drill, but that's all he knows. In everything else he does, it is as if he were still wearing his uniform. Noel was hardly alone and resenting the regimentation of military dressage, and many other recruits had a hard time squaring the fact that they were now rights-bearing citizens and electors at that. I mean, they actually, being in the army gave them the right to actually be active citizens as opposed to passive citizens, even if they didn't have much wealth. But they still had to, per regulation, learn 16 drill commands and twice as many sequenced movements simply to charge and fire their muskets. The revolution had ostensibly redeemed soldiers from their unflattering status under the old regime, the scum of the earth, in the Duke of Wellington's memorable phrase, a point that Napoleonic propaganda hammered away in flattering comparisons between boyish French soldiers and, quote, German automatons who wage war like machines. But few French soldiers, whether volunteers or conscripts, actually saw things that way, especially once the revolutionary fervor and genuine egalitarianism that initially pervaded the army gave way to draconian discipline and the more conventional forms of hierarchy during the Napoleonic period. For them, as for Noel, this was very much an experience of alienation, in the Marxian sense of the term, I think. This is the remarkable similarities with the kind of alienation he describes in the workplace at the beginning of the 19th century. The very day after having dissected military drill, Noel wrote his family in a radically different fashion. I ambled to the top of a nearby hill. I wish the three of us could have been there together. It almost felt as if the trees were already in bloom. By then, I will have no doubt obtained a short leave. This was the first time Noel mentioned the possibility of returning home on furlough to his beloved ones, barely a month into his service, a thought that offered momentary solace by collapsing duration and distance, but that would become a nagging obsession in the coming months. These two letters set the parameters, I think, of Noel's interstitial existence between two incommensurable worlds, separated both in space, here and there, military and home, and in time, past union, current separation, future hypothetical reunion. They frame a structure of feeling informed by pastoral and Rousseauian themes, quite clearly so, but that pervades the remainder of Noel's correspondence with juxtaposed images of military life on the one hand, nature and family hearth on the other, and of course Noel's constant emotional seesaw in between. Whichever way we characterize Noel's feelings, we are struck by the intensely nostalgic tone of his correspondence, perhaps even a sort of regressive tone. The young man's longing for home belied a more fundamental yearning for his lost childhood, an age of innocence menaced by the prospect of wartime brutalization. "I have learnt the terrible business of killing," he confessed to his increasingly worried mother after his first experience of combat, "but will always return home, gentle and human. You know well that you did not raise me to be a soldier forever." So long as he did have to be one, however, letters provided Noel with an emotional refuge in which to reminisce, daydream, in short, escape, even if just for a few hours. His nostalgia, in other words, did not just make him suffer, it also kept him going, a coping mechanism as much as an illness, and as such, strikingly similar to the flight into neurosis which Sigmund Freud diagnosed among those soldiers affected by traumatic neuroses during the Great War. Their peaceful civilian ego needed to escape from a newly acquired, warlike, aggressive ego, and a parasitic ego acquired as they became soldiers. Freud posited that this would lead them towards a form of primal regression all the way to childhood memories. And I think there's something similar to be said in this ironic, it's a sort of comical cartoon that the French cartoonist Scum made again as a commentary about the soldiers in Algeria. This is a French soldier writing their mum and dad, writing a letter to his parents saying, "I've finally captured the leader of the rebellion, and so I now think that that France will be able to finally conquer Algeria." I think his sort of despondent look actually sort of suggests something quite different about what the function of writing to dear mum and dad performed for these soldiers. Although they did not possess a working concept of psychological trauma, Napoleonic era and early 19th century era physicians conceived of nostalgia in these very similar sort of Freudian terms of two different egos battling it out within the what they would have called the soul, pointing to parallels between the soldier's plight, and the baby child's despair during weaning, arguing that what killed the nostalgic was, quote, the persuasion that his life habits have changed forever. Noel was diagnosed with nostalgia after a year at the front, and in an overjoyed letter home announcing his imminent return, he tellingly indicated that what he felt he actually had was less a maladie du pays than a maladie de la famille, a family sickness. In the long run, things worked out for him. He nursed his family sickness and returned to the front out of sheer patriotic duty, repeating this sort of back and forth for the next 5 years until granted a definitive discharge in 1797. He found a more agreeable way of serving the public good as mayor of his local town, and even managed, in a sense, to erase the years lost to war by marrying his beloved stepsister, a very Rousseauian turn to his life. But for many others, the war did not end, even after demobilization in 1814 and 1815. The war raged on in their head and in their inability to readapt to civilian life, eventually making them look back upon those days of Napoleonic glory with a hint of sick nostalgia. A nostalgia for the regiment, as their physicians suddenly started diagnosing it. A much more benign kind of nostalgia that sort of sustained them after a double displacement, not just in the army, but also in homecoming that turned out to not be the kind of restorative homecoming that they felt. Ironically, after having been the first victims of deadly nostalgia on the front, these soldiers now were the first, historically, to actually taste the bittersweet comforts of benign nostalgia as we have known it ever since, blissfully unaware of the tale of destruction, inner catastrophe, and primal regression that it emerged from. Thank you very much. And I look forward to your questions, obviously. Yes, please.
Well, I'm afraid of falling into anachronism, but the description that you give of nostalgia as a sickness unto death is very reminiscent of Korean War POWs
Okay.
who died in astonishing numbers, 2,000,
Mm-hmm.
And were accused, not sympathetically, accused of give-up-itis.
Yeah.
And yet the description that you gave is so close to descriptions I've read of those Korean War POWs
Yeah.
who die for no apparent physical reason.
Absolutely. No, I mean, I think there is for me, there is obviously a continuity there. The difference is in the way the doctors actually conceive of that of how, what is actually happening to these soldiers. What I find really interesting is this, and what you're saying reinforces this, is that, ironically, it's really in this period, in the 18th and early 19th century, soldiers were actually much more likely to get a sympathetic ear from their physicians than soldiers would throughout certainly the second half of the 19th century. During the American Civil War, already there's a lot of shaming going on of the nostalgic, the sort of whinging nostalgic soldiers. Codes of sort of, for lack of a better word, Victorian manliness, of course, have intervened in the process. But it's only really very recent. I mean, PTSD only sort of gets accepted in the 1980s, right? I mean, it's a very long road to sort of get back to the same kind of sympathy for these soldiers after this sort of mid-19th century break has happened.
It's not at all your period, but I'm curious about the Civil War, American Civil War, use of the term soldier's heart,
Yeah,
which was a sympathetic term.
right.
And if you look at Oliver Wendell Holmes's correspondence with his family, there's astonishing resemblance to Noel.
Okay, yeah, that's
Total
good. That's good.
patriotism and then a real disillusion with war.
Okay, yeah. No, I think, I mean, the similarities are all very, very strong, and not, and to a certain extent also in the physician's discourse. From what I know, and this is mostly from my several colleagues of mine who have worked on the American Civil War case. Susan Matt in particular has written a wonderful book on homesickness in American history. There is a struggle going on between in the medical corps as to how to treat these soldiers, how to deal with them, and there's a lot of sort of looking back to what the French physicians did 50, 60 years ago, and on the other hand, a lot of sort of very different approach to sort of shaming these people into sort of, so yeah. Yes, please. Back in
in talking about the Napoleonic Wars, you have a kind of interesting natural experiment because, of course, you had French soldiers in Napoleonic Wars, but before and after you had the French colonial military tradition. Do you see any difference in medical trajectories of soldiers in the colonial forces as compared to those who fought between 1795 and 1815? The conflict, the battles were quite different.
Battles are completely different, absolutely. The warfare is a very different kind of warfare. What's very interesting with the 1830s, 1840s, and 50s, which is in Algeria, which is a period that I sort of worked on in conjunction with this, is that you can clearly see physicians trying to use the same kind of discourse, the same categories of analysis that their predecessors used during the Napoleonic Wars, but it doesn't quite seem to work. It only works to a certain extent. This is a very different kind of war, much more sort of a sort of guerrilla kind of warfare, to sort of put it simply. Long periods of inactivity, so they start thinking of nostalgia more in terms of ennui, of boredom, which again sort of brings us towards sort of, you get, I think, similar configurations in wars like Vietnam, for example. I think there's a similar sort of discourse there of the boredom of war to a certain extent. But what really then changes is the medical, the sort of medical epistemologies of the time are shifting so radically by the mid-19th century that the discourse of nostalgia actually gets completely subsumed, completely wiped under the pseudo-scientific discourse of seasoning theories. So all of a sudden, soldiers who are not adapting well to conditions in Algeria are not sort of suffering because they're far from home, but they're suffering because of the different climate in Algeria. And so there's a sort of much more materialist medical discourse that literally wipes away the conditions of possibility for this much more kind of psychological, emotional medical discourse, in basically invalidating it. I mean, doctors say we used to talk of nostalgia. Now we can leave that to the poets. Let's do hard science and talk about seasoning. Okay, so that it's part of this moment when this opportunity is foreclosed because of changing codes of virility, because of changing medical theories, and also in part because of the changing nature of war. I think there isn't the same kind of the French 19th century army is obviously a very different army to the Napoleonic army. It's not such a mass army. I mean, in Algeria, it's maximum 100,000 people at a time, as opposed to being an army of several million people, as it is during the Napoleonic period. These are they're not officially conscripts, although technically they kind of are. But the configuration of what it means to be in the army, the kind of discipline that they're subjected to, I think is quite different. So I think there are differences there. Yeah. Yes.
Did you chance encounter the literature from, I think his name is David H. Marlowe, who's an anthropologist who
I don't think so.
this problem very seriously in the army,
Okay.
U.S. Army.
No, I haven't. I should.
And he essentially comes to very similar conclusions. If you're a romantic, or you're a more romantic view of this as more of a scientist,
Mm-hmm.
and he goes back to the Napoleonic era and explains why he uses an anthropologist. Discipline at first emerged.
Okay.
And got names. And he tracks the various
Oh, interesting.
shell shock and PTSD
Right.
and so forth through the history. But
And this is Marlowe, M-A-R-L-O-W?
L-O-W-E,
Okay.
published by
Rings a bell, but I'm
an
not sure. I should look at it.
think tank called RAND.
Okay. Yes. Right.
And
Okay. Thank you. I
he
should
did
definitely look at that.
in the 2000s. And I very much like your discussion, that it very much parallels his anthropological
Okay.
and psychiatric view of these things through the 500,000 people that the U.S. Army discarded in
Mhm.
World War II
Right.
for psychiatric injuries.
Yeah. I mean, World War II is a bit like Korea. Is this sort of
Yeah,
really dark? Yeah.
Napoleonic
Right.
era, which resulted in these mass casualties, psychiatric casualties of like type, of various means and illness, but very similar in the Civil War likewise.
Yeah. Well, great. Thank you. Thank you for the suggestion. I'll have to look at that. One more. Yep. Mary.
I'm
Hey, Lou.
curious about irony and
Aha.
how
Yes.
it might come up through this. And
In this picture here, yeah, I think there's a lot of irony. Yeah.
beyond both the disillusionment as well as the glory of war. And
Mm-hmm.
have you seen that come up?
It's not explicitly. It's not explicitly there, except in some very rare occasions. The French officer / romantic author Alfred de Vigny who writes a little bit about that. And he was a royalist who got into the army after Napoleon's fall. And never quite, and he sort of exemplifies this generation that could never live up to the glory days of the previous one. So he's constantly trying to sort of make his path through the army a sort of glorious one, but he misses out on the one campaign that the French actually do during the 1820s in Spain again, and he's not even able to go. And eventually in his sort of the slightly quite clearly autobiographical writings that he publishes on his experience, he contrasts. He says sort of towards the end that instead all that he could do was be jaundiced and frail, suffering from homesickness in his depot, his sort of army depot. So I think there is a sense whereby. Well, it shifts. That's also a moment of rupture, because up until this point, to be nostalgic up until this revolution Napoleonic period, to be nostalgic is a sign of an homme sensible, a man of sensibility, somebody who can shed tears, a sort of Rousseauian who is the sort of wonderful in that respect, and afterwards, after this sort of early 19th century break, it becomes much more a sign of weakness, of the lack of glory. So I think it can be sort of put in that perspective. But I'm not. This is a sort of side-tracking answer to your question. It's not something that comes up very much in the sources. I have to say. But I think it's very present here. I think there's irony in this. I'm giving a bit of a forceful reading, I think, of this cartoon. I'm not sure that it has anything much to do with nostalgia, but there's something. It's not just about look how silly our soldiers in Algeria are. They actually think that a child is the leader of the resistance. That child, I think, represents something more. I mean, and the fact that he's writing a letter to his mum and dad about it, I think is indicative of this something more. That, I mean, it's all about mothers and sons, as far as I can tell.
We'll have to stop it there. Please join me in thanking Thomas.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Just a quick announcement. We are back next week in our normal space across the street in LJ 119 for the third of our three-part Blumberg dialogues on astrobiology. We have an active astrobiology research program, and next week we'll be examining the intersection of astrobiology and the arts. So please join us for that. We also do have an events survey that the entire institution is undertaking at the moment to learn more about our events and get your feedback. So if you are willing to help us out with that, please fill out the survey and you can drop it on the table on your way out. Thank you again for joining me, and thank you, Thomas.
Thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.